In terms of the stuff, due dates this Friday, due dates for exam 1, quizzes, assignments, part 1, the pretest and the pre-survey. As always, be sure to check on any of the assignments, quizzes, and exams to see when the available until date is, because the due date is when you should probably do it. If you don't do it, nothing happens. So there's that. But the available until date is the critical date, because that's when the work becomes no longer available on Blackboard. And you can check any of the assignments, exams, quizzes, etc. without doing it, of course, or starting it. Just click on it and it'll have when it's due and when it's available until. And the available until is 100%, not 100% full credit. But we're going on to a quick recap of chapter 3 and then on to chapter 4. Anything about any previous stuff or stuff to be that needs more stuff. We'll also recording it. It'll go up on Canvas or YouTube and Canvas as soon as I have it done.
Could you go to the vagueness degree?
Sure. So one of the critical notions in chapter 3 is vagueness. And the basic idea is that, put in by metaphor, it's kind of like foggy or fuzzy. So you can't really, it's not clear where you are, where you're going. Taking away the metaphor, getting to the formal, vagueness is it's less precise, less detailed than it needs to be. So the problem is a lack of clarity due to a lack of detail, precision, or information. So for example, like if you ask me, when is exam 1 due? And I said, sometime this week, that's pretty big. If I say it's due Friday, less vague. If I say it's due Friday by 11:59 p.m., that's very precise. So vagueness is generally, in terms of the degrees, the main concern is, the purpose at hand. There can be things that are, you could say, yes, this is vague for this context, which would be bad, but another context may be fun. So like going to that example, if I just say, exam 1 is due sometime this semester, very vague. And then the more exact I get, like if I say it's due this week, more precise. Then if I say Friday, more precise still, and Friday, particular time, even more precise. Anything else? Okay, so there's vagueness, which you looked at, ambiguity, that's 2 or more meanings, not clear what is intended. And these can occur both unintentionally, essentially a person just not being careful or making certain assumptions, but they can also be used intentionally. They can be weaponized. And the types of ambiguity looked at include semantic, which is the meaning of the term, syntactics, which is the grammar or structure of the thing, and then of course the grouping ambiguity, which is it's not clear whether you're talking about things, say individually or individual to individual, or talking about them collectively or group to group. And a classic example of this is the Second Amendment. When it refers to the right of people to keep and bear arms, there is the question, a reasonable one, was the intent that I get a gun, you get a gun, everyone gets a gun, or was it that collectively as a people, we have a right to an army that's responsible to people as say responsible to the king or president. I mean, I know the president's the commander in chief, but there's a difference between a force just serving the will of the ruler and a force presumably dedicated to the citizens. Then we looked about a generality, and we looked at how to deal with vagueness and ambiguity, and then we headed into land of definitions. Oh, sure. Yep.
Generality, that's just like being broad.
Yes.
You're saying like animal, like with specific.
Yeah, exactly. So generality, like vagueness, also comes in degrees. So you could have like animal, then you'd have maybe like more or less general would be maybe like dog, and even more specific might be a particular named dog, like Remy or Marmaduke or something. Yeah, so something could be general and vague, but it would depend, vagueness is generally seen as kind of like a bad thing. So there are terms that are general that are perfectly fine as general because they want to capture a lot of stuff. So, like in biology, you've got, the animal kingdom, and you wouldn't say, oh, well, you might say it's kind of a vague definition, but you wouldn't say like, oh, that's bad because it's too vague. It's a very general thing catching a lot under. So general just means it covers a lot, and vagueness means it's fuzzy. Now, of course, you could have something that is, in a way, general because it is fuzzy. It's including a lot of stuff in a bad way. Then we headed to definitions, and we saw that in terms of how we define stuff, we can define things by synonym. A word that means the same, or words mean the same as the original. Definition by example, which is giving examples, or in the case of extension, pointing at things. And analytical, which are the ones we looked at more complicated. You say what a thing belongs to, what group it belongs to, and then how it differs. So if you're talking about, say, a gaming keyboard versus a normal keyboard, you would say it's a keyboard, so it's got the keys, and then you'd say how it's different. And that would typically involve things like people often have mechanical switches on as opposed to non-mechanical, or might have like macro buttons and other features. Or the difference between, say, dress shoes and non-dress shoes. So between racing shoes and non-racing shoes. You'd say like it'd be a type of shoe, obviously used for competition. Then we looked at the rhetorical definitions, which attempt to sway people's feelings. And then we looked a bit at writing, and then we got to chapter 4. But before going to 4, any 3 stuff that needs more stuff. Okay. So you might not, probably won't get through all of chapter 4 today. So that's okay. I wanted to change any available until dates because exam 1 is due this Friday, but you don't have to be it's available until way beyond that. Same with like the quizzes and assignments. And whatever we don't cover, I'll double check to make sure that it is in fact available beyond this time. And the reason why I was a bit behind is because sometimes week 1 we have 2 classes. Sometimes week 1 in spring we just have, depends on whatever. So in chapter 4, here are objectives or mini quests. So chapter 4 is pretty much about credibility. And this has always been important because there are always people trying to deceive us, either intentionally or sometimes people are misguided, but not malicious. They just don't know what they're talking about, and they're not trying to be evil. They just don't know what they're talking about. And so it's important to distinguish between credible and the non-credible. Credibility, of course, is kind of like vagueness, comes in degrees. And when we're assessing this, some critical things we'll look at will be sources that are interested versus disinterested. And as we'll see, this isn't like, wow, I find that really interesting. It's that you got stake in it. You've got money on the table, so to speak, and people who don't. Then we'll look at assessing our own observations and those of others, experiences, background information, etc. And also, especially important today in the age of disinformation, being able to evaluate sources to determine if we should accept them as probably credible, reject them as probably non-credible, or say, don't know, suspend judgment, always an option. So we'll look at assessing people based on expertise and knowledge, look at the news. This, of course, is always been a point of contention. Can you trust the news? And this goes way back to the time, if anybody here is in journalism or has history classes, you probably heard of Hearst, the famous newspaper guy, and how he supposedly started the Spanish-American War to sell more newspapers. Is that true? Maybe. And so we've always had concerns about, news that is untrue. And of course, today it's a big battle point in the endless culture wars. We'll also look at advertising, and mostly how to defend against it. Because advertising, as someone humorously once said, is the art of turning off people's brains to get their money. So why should we care about credibility? Well, basically, in the case of people who are unintentionally providing false information or harmful information, we obviously don't want to be hurt by this information. And presumably, if they're not malicious, they would want us not to be hurt either. So essentially, we have the following concerns: things that can kill us, things that can harm us in various ways. And again, some people spread this information in a way without any malicious intent. They're just wrong, but they're not malicious. And then, of course, there are people who have one intent. They probably know what they're saying is untrue, and they're being deceptive to harm you, to get your money, etc. And so the reason to be on guard against this is because, literally, no exaggeration, your life could be at stake. Misinformation could kill you. Now, this can range, of course, from things that can literally kill you to much more minor things that can inconvenience you or cost you a little money, etc. So, how do you tell when you should trust a source? And when should you trust a claim? Well, this assumes we're getting a claim that is not backed up by an argument. So if the claim is backed up by an argument, we would assess the logic of the argument, which we'll see in the future. We'll talk about the deductive and the inductive. But these are cases where we get just, here's a claim. Now, even with arguments, premises themselves, like, you don't argue for every premise, because otherwise you'd be arguing to infinity. And so even when assessing an argument.
You said, why should we trust the claim? And then after that, we should trust the source.
Oh, two things to consider. Should we trust the claim itself? Is it credible? The second thing is, should we trust the source? So when we're assessing any claim, those are our two, assuming it matters, you'd want to look at the claim itself. Is this something I should accept as probably true, reject as probably false, or suspend judgment? Then the second thing is the source. Is the source credible or not? So when we're assessing claims, again, when it matters, we'd look at the claim itself to assess it, and we'd also look at where it comes from. And these are essentially things that can either grant credibility or take away credibility. Like to use like an everyday non-death example, if you go on like Amazon to buy something, if you're wondering whether you should like buy the thing or not, what do you often look at in terms of deciding between, say, suppose it's like 4 or 5 or 1,000 competing products? How do you decide like which one to probably buy? Oh, it's normal shopping. When you go on Amazon, and you're trying to decide between like today I was getting an adapter for my phone, so I can just carry my phone instead of my whole laptop, plug it in. And of course, there are a lot of Lightning to HDMI adapters on Amazon. So if you're going to buy one, what would you look at on Amazon? You look at price, but if you want to know, if you want to have an idea, like, is it good or bad, you look at the reviews. Yeah, you look at the reviews. And you have to decide, can you trust that review? So one thing you look at is what's said in the review. So you assess the credibility of the claim itself, see if it's plausible or implausible. And in the case of an adapter, mostly, people aren't going to say like crazy things about it. They're not going to say like it cures cancer or fires laser beams or something. They'll probably say like credible things like, even things like it broke right away. A lot of products do that. So a lot of the claims themselves would seem initially kind of plausible because stuff breaks, or if they say it's like really good, also kind of plausible because stuff can be really good. And so what we have to do is look at the source to know if we can trust the source or not. Now, when it comes sort of in a way, I mean, I look at the reviews too, but in a way, can you trust reviews on Amazon? The answer is probably not. I mean, some you can look at, and if you have someone giving like this in-depth, very rational, careful analysis, complete with pictures, etc., in a way they've kind of established credibility because they seem to know what they're talking about, and they put in like a lot of work. So maybe not a scam, but in many cases, we have doubts about the source of the claim for the following. Very good reason. Have you ever bought something on Amazon or any place? I'll just use Amazon because that's where everyone buys everything. And you get the thing, and they offer you what for a 5-star review? Nope. Anybody ever got one of those? Yeah, well, maybe I'm the only one, but I bought things and I've gotten like little things saying, leave a 5-star review on Amazon, send us a picture, and we'll send you $20 Amazon gift card. And I looked at that, I'm like, no wonder I've had so many 5-star reviews, because you get $20 for reviewing a $15 product. That's a good deal. Did I do the review? No. Because it'd be morally wrong. I'm an ethics professor. I'd be like, this is evil. I can't do this. I thought about it for a second, then I thought this would be morally wrong because I'd be doing something dishonest. If I was going to do something dishonest for money, I'd be a lawyer. I'm sorry. I'd be a politician and not a philosopher. So how do we, or I guess kind of the first question is credibility. Now, there are essentially two types of credibility. One is psychological credibility, which means that people believe the person who has this credibility, whether they really should or not. This is kind of like psychological reasons. Celebrities have a lot of this credibility. People believe them even when they're talking about stuff they don't know anything about. For example, not to pick on Kid Rock, but to pick on Kid Rock, what has he been saying lately? Why is he in the news again? What? No one follows Kid Rock? Well, he's like anti-Fauci now. He's like swearing at Fauci. So in that case, is Kid Rock an expert on medicine and epidemiology and viruses? No, he's a musician. And so, I mean, obviously people in a democracy, people have a right of, with a protection of free expression, has the right to say things that are probably untrue. He doesn't really have credibility, but he does have influence. And celebrities like Gwyneth Paltrow, et cetera, do have a lot of influence. But of course, when they're speaking in fields they're not experts in, they don't really have the other type of credibility, which is what you might call real or logical credibility. So one type of credibility again is psychological. How much sway and influence does a person have in terms of people believing them because they say so, whether it's true or not. Now, good credibility, logical credibility, is that a person does have, the qualifications, the expertise, the honesty, etc., which would mean that a person should be believed, as opposed to people will probably believe them. There's the question of should you believe them. So again, two types of credibility. One is psychological, how one can sway people into believing that one is credible, versus actually being truly credible, which is having, this expertise, this honesty, etc. And we'll look at, of course, how to get the good credibility. Now, getting like bad credibility is kind of like becoming like, obviously just a matter of being famous and influential. A person doesn't need to know what they're talking about. They just need to do whatever it takes to be famous, whatever that mystery thing is. So a person's credibility essentially is a measure of how reasonable, how rational it would be to believe them, as opposed to the psychological one, which is a measure of how likely people are to believe them based primarily on feels or bad logic. So when should you be suspicious? Well, in the case of claims, It's when the claim is got some issues. In the case of sources, also, of course, when the source has some concerns. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that even if a claim seems sketchy, it could still be true. Even if a claim seems likely to be true, could still be false. Even if a source seems really sketchy, they could be right. And sometimes, I mean, there are famous cases where some sketchy like tabloid got something right. So we can't say that something is false just because it comes from someplace sketchy. That would actually be a fallacy. We'll see in the future. And likewise, we can't say for sure that something is true just because the source is credible. I mean, it's reasonable to believe claims from credible sources, but it's not guaranteed to be true because credible sources can get things wrong. So suppose you get a claim and you're looking at it in terms of should I accept this, reject it, or not. So here's how we run a check. And we do a lot of this kind of like automatically. We don't even really think about it. We just kind of hear something and you get kind of an initial, intuition about accepting it or rejecting it. But here are the things we would check. First, where it's, possible, we would run it against our own observations. What have we ourselves seen, heard, etc. And if it matches up, that's a plus. If it doesn't match up, that's a minus. So for example, if someone says there are no native penguins in Florida, that's nice. I mean, I haven't been over every part of Florida, but I've been to quite a bit of Florida, and I've never seen like penguins just roaming about. Next is our background information. This is stuff we've learned over years, and if something goes against that, then we would tend to rationally have suspicions about it. If something matches it, we would tend to say rationally this is more plausible. Now, of course, as we'll see, our own observations can be wrong, and our background information can be false. And then lastly, we would check a claim against other credible claims. So we kind of match it up against things that we already accept as being plausible, as being probably true. So for example, going with the kind of silly penguin example, what I know about penguins, what I've learned about them over the years, is never heard of them being in Florida, and they have a general preference for colder areas. And of course, other credible claims about where penguins live, those are generally say they don't live in Florida. So that's why I believe that penguins are not native to Florida. Maybe there were some like ancient, prehistoric penguins, but yeah. Yes.
It was like person credibility is how reasonable he is. I didn't get to that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, credibility is a measure of how reasonable it is from the standpoint of like logic to believe that their claim. And if someone's got a high credibility, then it's rational, it's reasonable to accept what they say is probably true. At least in, as we'll see, under a certain set of circumstances. So firstly, looking at assessing just claims on their own, like you get a claim and you're wondering, is this claim itself plausible or implausible? First thing we look at is our own personal observations. And this of course is obviously limited to what we can observe ourselves. Some things will be, beyond our observations because we weren't there. So for example, if we take the claim that an insurrection happened on January 6th, we could say, yeah, we saw stuff on TV, which I guess would be kind of a way of observing. But if you weren't there personally, then you wouldn't have like direct observations. Again, you could have like television observations, but you wouldn't have direct observations. And so in some cases, we won't have these because we weren't there, we didn't see it. Now, again, you could bring in things like seeing it on television or YouTube, etc. And then you have to address questions about, was the thing you're seeing, was that like modified, fake, or not? Now, the obvious, one obvious thing about our own observations is they're not infallible. It's kind of pretty obvious. We can be wrong. But although seeing is believing, seeing and believing is not necessarily the same as truth. So how can our observations, our own or those of other people, go wrong? Well, one thing is, of course, when observation conditions. So if it's a visual thing, how is the lighting, how's the weather, what's the distance, all those would be relevant factors, angles of viewing, and so on. Now, if you've ever watched like law shows, especially the ones that are good at focusing on the actual legal aspect of it, these are things that good lawyers will bring up. So if they're challenging a witness's statement, one thing they'll obviously ask, if it's like a visual witness, if they're a defense attorney and the person's like witness for the prosecution, they'll try to raise questions about the viewing conditions. They'll ask the obvious things like, how far away was the person? What was the light? What was the weather? And those are all reasonable questions, because even if the person is reporting what they think they saw, if the lighting was bad or the distance was far, they could be unsure. Like one kind of silly extreme example of this was years ago. I was at the Godby High School track doing some speed work early in the morning. And I'm running around and I saw what looked like it was a UFO. It looked like a triangle in the sky with lights on each point. I thought, oh, the aliens are here. It's like when the teacher did it. And then there are other people on the track and no one was like panicking. And so I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't start screaming about aliens at this point, because maybe it's not aliens. And as I ran a little further, I could see that it wasn't an identified flying object, because I didn't know what it was, but it was the Goodyear blimp heading to the FSU game. Or the aliens' illusion technology had failed, and I saw their ship and put it back up to be the Goodyear blimp. Most likely not alien. But at that angle, it looked like a flying triangle spaceship. But of course, it was probably not. Less silly if you're trying to drive and it's raining and dark. It's obviously harder to see things. And so, like if there's an accident ahead and someone says, like what exactly happened, you might honestly say, I'm not sure. Dark and raining, etc. Next, people obviously have different powers of observations. These can include obvious things like eyesight, quality of eyesight, but also a person's skill or ability or experience at interpreting what they see. So someone may not have like great eyesight, but they could have knowledge that allows them to make distinctions. I mean, a good example would be identifying like a particular species of bird. Like a person who's an ornithologist may not have great eyesight, but they know birds. And so their statement that it was like a blue jay or a different type of bird would be more credible than someone who might have really good eyesight, but not know anything about birds. And this is also, again, something that, to use the obvious example of law, good lawyers bring. So if the person, like a witness, normally wears glasses or contacts, a good lawyer would always ask, were you wearing your glasses or contacts? Because if a person's not, their visual observations are less credible. A good example of this it's an old movie, but it's a good one, which is what I'm sure old people say about old movies. 12 Angry Men, the original one. I think they remade it, probably because they remake everything. But the original one is a good movie, but it's also essentially like a textbook case of, well, this goes through like all the sort of things about law, etc. But it does so in a way that's like actually really good. It's one of those rare movies where they do a really good job, like looking at, kind of critical thinking about the law, yet have it still be really well done. An interesting movie. Next, psychological effects. Our beliefs, hopes, fears, and expectations affect what we see. They shape it. What are some examples of this? Well, one common thing, and we'll see this more in the future when we talk about fallacies, is wishful thinking. Now, the fallacy, which we'll see in the future, is that someone infers that because they want something to be true, that it must be true. And this also affects perceptions. When people want to see something, they will often see it. To use like an everyday example, like if someone's repairing, like they're working on their computer and they drop like a very small critical part that rolls on the floor, when they're looking to try to find it, every little bit of shiny thing they see, their brain will say, that's the part. And they'll pick it up. It's like, nope, not part, that's not part. And so our brains kind of like what we want to see, our brain kind of goes looking for. So if you ever like work with really small things and like lose a piece, your brain is going to see everything as that piece. Or if you lose like your car key, like in the field or someplace, you're going to spot like all these, any little bit of metal or something, your brain's going to say that's my key. Now, a much more serious example is a phenomenon that occurs during hunting season. There's if you're familiar with like deer hunting, there's a phenomenon called buck fever, which is when people get like crazed to kill deer, and everything they see, their brain tells them is deer. Which is why, well, one reason when you're in any place where it's like hunting season, you definitely want to wear like orange, not anything brown or white, because deer are not orange. And hopefully people's brains will work well enough that when they see orange, they won't shoot you. Not guaranteed. And you definitely don't want to wear like anything white, because if you move your hand or something, people will think that's like a deer tail. This white-tailed deer, white tail, they pump it up when they're scared, and that's a target. And so I'm from Maine, and Maine's like a big hunting state. Actually, I think all the states are probably big hunting states. And every year we get people, who get shot because someone thinks they're a deer. And there was a case where someone was in their backyard, hanging their clothing, wearing white gloves, and they got shot. And I mean, they were in hunting. It wasn't like someone in town just like shooting stuff. They were in an area where hunting was allowed. And the person, they got in trouble, but it wasn't considered like murder because of the gloves. Essentially, it's not that the person deserved to be shot. It's just that, well, there's all these distinctions of like homicide and murder and so forth. And so the psychological effect of that was recognized.
So this person died?
Yeah, I believe so. Where they got shot with a high-powered hunting rifle designed to kill deer. I think they were dead. I have to check the story again, like the details of it. They were definitely shot, and I think they probably died.
They just wore the wrong gloves.
Yep, wrong gloves. And in a lot of rural places, you can hunt around people's like camps and houses and stuff. Well, obviously, like they're hunting camps, so you also have to kind of worry that someone may be like shooting, and they're not, the bullet, they'll go a long way. We think of rifles as being long range, but like super long range, but a 22 long rifle round can go up to a mile. Just keep on going until it hits something. And high-powered rifles will go quite a ways. And they can sail through the woods. You could be like sitting in your house or your car or something, and unlikely, but a bullet could just come fly out of the woods and hit you. And it does happen from time to time. And again, if someone's wearing something that looks like a deer, or they make a noise and they're wearing orange, there's a chance someone they'll think they're a deer and accidentally shoot. Now, it also, of course, happens with things involving fears. The classic one, common one is like with snakes. If someone is afraid of snakes and they're like in the woods, every vine and twig and stuff, their brain will say snake, 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 and they'll be scared. Other biases would include, well, prejudices, etc. How people observe people as being like threatening or dangerous, and this can be a matter of well, common factors obviously would be things like racism tends to fuel people to perceive other people as being, dangerous or up to no good, and that's very well documented. Age is also a factor. Older people stereotypically are often presented as being like more suspicious of the youth, that the youth are up to something. Now, it's interesting how the brain can take something, that's not the thing, and psychologically making it something terrifying. I had to use one kind of silly example. When I was in grad school, one of my roommates was in nursing school, and she had like not really unreasonable, but she was terrified of roaches. And grad school makes you psychotic, so I decided to like mess with her. So I took a couple of cotton balls and some athletic tape and wrapped them around, took some brown shoe polish and put it on. And that thing, as you might imagine, looked like a blob of cotton and tape, and not like a roach at all. But I walked past her and flipped it into her hair, which was terrible. I was doing wrong. And I said, "Oh my God, Tammy, a roach." And she lost her mind because it looked, she looked at her hair and she was terrified of it, and she freaked out completely. I feel bad about doing that. But as far as she was concerned, it was the demon roach of Ohio come to do some terrible murders or something. And so I did the setup, so psychologically she believed it was a roach. Even though, of course, again, it looked like a ball of cotton and tape and stuff. Nothing like that. So people's psychological biases can have a huge impact on it. Now, in some cases, this can be like honest, I don't want to say like, I guess honest bias. The person really does feel that, even though their perception is wrong. And of course, if you're familiar with the way this is exploited, people can claim that they were, afraid and try to exploit that notion that they perceived it as threatening or dangerous, even though they perhaps did not feel that at all. Because if you're familiar with like stand your ground laws, they vary, text, but the gist is basically if a person doesn't have to retreat when they feel threatened, and generally they, again, varies from law to law, that a person is allowed to use deadly force when they feel afraid. And that, of course, that's a really vague, definition. Because everyone's got different levels of fear, and as you might imagine, even if someone's like being honest in their fear, like they're really feeling afraid, biases can have a huge impact, because what people are afraid of is typically set by their biases in terms of other people, etc. And in some cases, professionals attempt to like address this with training, like police bias training, etc. Also less like involving death, things like interviews and employment and assessment, etc. There are also sexist biases. So there's many classic studies where they took work and put like a woman's name on it and had the same work with a man's name and asked people to grade it. And the one with the man's name consistently got like a better grade, even though they were literally the same. And so people's biases cause them to see anything from threats to terrifying things to things that are better or worse. And essentially, as humans, we're basically a mess in terms of our bias and stuff. We generally don't see reality, if there is such a thing, correctly at all. Now, as you might imagine, getting back to the context of law, which is pretty good context for this, lawyers who are skilled take this into account. For example, one of the most famous examples was the O.J. Simpson trial, the original one, not the later ones. And they were able to show that one of the police officers was pretty clearly racist, and that showed that the person's testimony was biased. And that's a legitimate concern, because if someone is biased, even if they're saying what they think is true, like they're not intentionally lying, this can sway their perceptions. And so, a good lawyer will always go in and look for biases. Either, trying to find people who are biased the way they want, or trying to point out biases and witnesses that are harmful to their client. Now, despite our perceptions being kind of a mess, this is one of the best sources of information in a way, because it's kind of all you're laying aside like, philosophical stuff. It's kind of all we got. That's how we get information about the world for the most part, is our observations. And we need to keep an account like what a mess it is, but as they say, it's kind of the only game in town. So on the side of good, when you're assessing your own observations, you'd want to take into account these potential defects. Also on the side of good, when considering other people, you'd want to take them into account too, both in terms of seeing how they could be mistaken, but also in some cases, this is more of like a kind of like an ethical thing, or being nice, where people may have views you disagree with, but you may understand why they might, say what they say. They may be not saying things they believe to be untrue, but they're affected by their beliefs, hopes, fears, and especially, biases. On the side of evil, these are really exploitable in terms of, getting people, manipulating people, going in, for example, a attorney who's trying to prosecute someone may obviously play on the biases and fears of, the jury, trying to cash in on those to turn them, against the defense. Now, obviously, the prosecutor is obligated to make the best case, truthfully and honestly, but of course, they can get a bit zealous or try to make a name for themselves for whatever reason, and do more than what their job is supposed to be. And these are things that can be, very easily exploited. They do say sometimes if everybody's going to law school, it's probably an exaggeration, but they do say that the trial is won during the picking of the jury. Basically, if you select people who are likely to be biased in the right way, you're probably going to win. And this is, as you might imagine, this has raised some, moral concerns, because then the outcome of the trial is not based so much on what's the truth, but on who was able to, really work the system the best, and how is it, who is it stacked for, and who is stacked against. And so they worked on some. This goes way beyond perfect thinking, but they're working on systems that are trying to be less biased, at least in some places. Some places, definitely not. So first thing we run against is, okay, what have I seen, heard, etc. myself? The next thing is we run the check against our background information. This is all the stuff that we picked up over the years, and it's called background because we don't have like a particular thing to, particular claim to point to. And we've got a bunch of this, all of us have a bunch of this. For example, it's kind of a chilly day, but would you warm yourself up having a nice piping hot cup of bleach? Why not? Yeah, probably kill it, because bleach is a very good disinfectant. It kills stuff super good, including giant centipedes. Found that out in Ohio. For real. It'll take them right out. I think it was the weirdest, biggest centipede I ever saw. And at first I thought it was like hallucinating or something, because it's like 3 a.m. I was not drinking or anything, but when you see things like weird things at 3 a.m. in Ohio, you think maybe it's something else. But it was real. They're a real thing. So yeah, you definitely wouldn't want to drink bleach. there probably was never a time where someone told you, like, by the way, never drink hot bleach, have like hot coffee or hot soup instead. But we know not to, most of us know not to do that. I've been using that example for a really long time. And it became kind of weird when people were actually drinking bleach to try to cure COVID and stuff. But no, definitely no subjectivity there. Bleach is definitely something you don't want to drink. So we don't know exactly where we got that, but we've all pretty much got that. We also know things like don't stick things in, forks into light sockets, even if you've never seen someone do it or if you've never done it yourself. We have all these things in our background information that we picked up over the years, and we use them to kind of like test things. And we do it subconsciously. We don't sit there and, we don't hear our, our brain kind of clicking away, testing stuff. We hear a thing and we basically think, or that's BS. Now, one problem with our background information, though, is everyone's background information also has got a lot of stuff in there that's not true. I know I believe a lot of things that aren't true, but I don't know which things I believe are not true, because if I knew they weren't true, I wouldn't believe them anymore. The reason I know that I have a lot of things I believe that aren't true is because I found out, sometimes the hard way, that my beliefs were not true, that I was mistaken about something. Sometimes just, oh, I'm wrong. Other times like, oh, I'm lucky I didn't die for being wrong about that particular thing. And so I know that my background information is full of all kinds of stuff that's not true, but obviously I don't know which ones are true and which ones are not, at least in many cases. So we always have to be careful and always consider that we could be wrong. And this is why, when you go into a profession, you try to learn stuff that's true, and you kind of explicitly try to like clear out things in your profession field that are untrue. You've got examples like medical fields. That's medicine gets it's a living field, so things change. Can change pretty rapidly. What could initially be considered like an effective treatment may turn out with further research to be ineffective, or maybe even more effective, or maybe actually harmful and dangerous, given the best information people have. And this is something we do actively in our professions. We, when you're going, obviously go to college to learn stuff, you're clearing out hopefully stuff that's not true, and hopefully putting in stuff that's true. But you're also getting a lot of stuff that's untrue. Not because we're trying to trick you, but because a lot of what we think is true will turn out to be not true. Sometimes it's, oh, that's not true. And sometimes it's, wow, we're lucky we didn't all die because we were wrong. So when we get a claim and we hear it and it matters, we do kind of an initial assessment. And this is typically a subconscious. Now, of course, you can do it consciously if you want, obviously. And we assign things an initial plausibility. Initial, of course, means, right away first. And plausibility is what? If something's plausible, then it's
Possible.
Yeah, possible. Yeah, accurate. It's something that is seems likely to be true. And we just do this kind of automatically. So, for example, suppose I said I ran a 2-minute mile in college. Would you believe me? No, because no one, that'd be like world famous. But suppose I said I broke 5 minutes in the mile. Would you believe that? That's actually true. I used to be, back in the day, I was fast at one time. Now I still move. It's all about lowered expectations and lowered. So, yeah, based on the claim itself, we can have initial plausibility. And of course, it could still be, something can seem plausible, but turn out to be untrue. And something can be implausible and turn out to be true. Like, I know some people, if you looked at them, you wouldn't think they were that fast. They, they're like crazy fast at running. Even looking at them, you'd say, no, they don't look fast at all. And then you see them go, you're like, wow, they're really fast. Now, our next thing is So we looked at our observations, when should we trust them, those of others. There's a lot of background stuff. And the way to get good at assessing stuff is have lots of good background information. Again, as you're training for your profession, your field, etc., you're trying to get in all this stuff, stored away so you can make, good judgments. And there's always the question that people have asked, like, why should I learn stuff when I've always got like Google and Wikipedia and stuff? Well, the obvious thing is, memorization is not as important as it used to be. Back before you could carry everything in your pocket, you can only have what you had in your head or books. Books are pretty heavy. So now memorization is not really that as critical, but it's still useful because the things you'll have to know do, and if you're having to look up stuff constantly, obviously Wikipedia, that's really going to cut into your time. And kind of a practical thing is, what things should I know, and what things can I kind of rely on other sources for? That still is, G.I. Joe used to say, knowing is half about it. And you want to have true stuff in there, because otherwise, well, it's untrue. It's simply not true. So what about getting info from other people? Or what if you want to be credible yourself? Well, as I mentioned, there's psychological credibility, which is sort of the emotional, this includes like emotional things and non-emotional psychology, which incline people to believe claims made by the person, whether they're true or not. Then there's what we call like real credibility, which are qualities that a person has that would give you an actual logical reason to accept their claims as probably true. Now, as always, keep in mind that someone could be seemingly like utterly lacking credibility, but could still be right. And someone could be incredibly credible, but still get things wrong, because people aren't infallible. Even brilliant, educated, capable people make mistakes. And even people who don't know what they're talking about 99% of the time, that 1% of the time, they say something true. The first thing to look at is, when assessing credibility of source, is whether the person is, or group is interested or not. And again, this doesn't mean like interested like in you like it, you're like fascinated. To have an interest in something means, to use like metaphor, you've got money on the table. You stand to gain or lose if people believe or don't believe. Now, in the case of being disinterested, it means you don't have a meaningful stake. It doesn't like benefit you or harm you if people believe this. Now, obviously, you could take almost any situation and show how a person could like potentially benefit or potentially like be harmed. But you look at, what is a person, how much would they have to gain? Do they get something getting you to believe it, even if it's not true? So, for example, think of like a medical doctor. Yeah, they do have an interest in your health, hopefully, if they're in it for like good reasons. And they do have an interest in your health, but they don't have an interest, hopefully, to, again, if they're like a good doctor, they don't have an interest in you believing like you should cut back on like salt or something in a nefarious way. They want you to be healthier, like lower blood pressure, etc. So they're not like up to something. Now, example of like bad interest would be if there was, say, like your blood pressure could, the doctor knew your blood pressure could be lowered if you had like less salt, cut back on salt and caffeine, your blood pressure would be fine. But instead they decide to, well, what's an alternative that could be like a problem? So suppose like you go to the doctor and one option is your blood pressure is a little high. One option that's free is less salt, less caffeine. What might an ethical doctor suggest? Yeah, medicine, because they may get some money from pharmaceutical companies, which does happen. So in that case, if they prescribe something that they profit from, that they're the company that sells it gives them, gives them money or vacations, etc. In that case, they do have an interest in it because they're benefiting financially. So it's not just like the person, cares or it's like beneficial. It's generally, again, is there something that they gain from you believing it, whether it's true or not. And again, so like again, a good doctor would have an interest in telling you, like, okay, you lower your salt, less caffeine. They care, hopefully they care about you. In that case, they're not biased. But if they're trying to get you to take medicine that they get like vacations or cash to push, then they would be an interested party. Now, a person could be an interested party and still be right. So, for example, it could be the case where the doctor is getting vacations and money and kickbacks from like a drug company, but they're right. You actually say do need this medication. And so just because someone's got some stake in it doesn't mean they're wrong. Like politics is a good example. Every politician obviously has a stake in getting elected. In a way, this is one reason why in general they have low credibility, because they always have a stake in the game. They want to be in office. But this doesn't mean that their claims are necessarily untrue. So if that's saying like politicians or anybody who wants power or money, you've always got to take that into account. Something like with any business. Every business wants to get your what? Your money. And it doesn't mean that they're always lying. I mean, it means that they often lie or, kind of like blur the truth, but their claims could be actually true in some cases. So the mere fact that someone's got a stake in it doesn't mean they're lying. And the fact that someone doesn't have a stake doesn't mean they're always right. But in general, you should be skeptical, critical to the degree the person can gain something. So if someone's trying to sell you something, be it a drug, be it a computer, be it a car, be it an ideology, be it a politician, be it religion, you should always be critical and take into account that question, how much is their stake in it influencing what they're saying? Again, it doesn't mean they're wrong, but if there's literally they're getting paid to say it, credibility is low. This is why, as a practical matter, like in the case of politics, this is why many people who support transparent government believe that you should always know who's funding political campaigns, because that way you know who's biasing them. Not surprising, the people who give money, they want to make that anonymous, and they usually make arguments like freedom, etc. But of course, if we're trying to pick a politician, it makes sense when we're assessing them to know who's paying them, because that is biasing them, that affects their credibility. Now, one can make an argument there should be anonymous donors, which would be a moral dispute, but that would make it more difficult to judge who owns your politician. You should be able to see who owns them. And in most cases now, we can see who owns politicians. It's pretty clear who has paid for them. Now, here's a list of qualities that are good or bad for psychological credibility, but have nothing at all to do with real credibility. So as a practical standpoint, on the side of good, you'd want to say all these things don't matter in terms of credibility. No plus, no minus. Now, also fair on the side of good, as I mentioned before, if you've got like true things to say, you don't want to impair your own case. Like again, like the analogy is food. If you're making healthy food, you don't want to make it taste bad. It's fine to make it taste good. Likewise, if you're doing like a presentation, a speech, and you believe what you're saying is true, you're being honest, then you definitely would want to use these things, because to intentionally do the opposite or not use them would put you at a disadvantage. But it's so important to keep in mind that these logically don't matter. Now, on the side of evil, these are very useful to deceive people. A person can have like negative credibility, logically speaking, but use these to be believed because they're very powerful. So here are some things. First, eye contact. There's a false belief that if someone looks you right in the eyes, they must be telling the truth. But is that true? No, people can look at you right in the eyes and lie. I mean, true, people who are like ethical sometimes get a little uncomfortable when they're lying, but it's not a good guide. I've had people I know they're lying to me because they're saying things that are like actual logical contradictions. It can't all be true. And their persons, if they look me right in the eye, their expression never changed. They were a very good liar. Oh, except for the contradictions. You never want to do contradictions when you deal with a philosopher because they recognize them. So eye contact means nothing, logically speaking. Now, psychologically, it does because we tend to believe people who can look us right in the eye and we think, oh, they're probably honest, even though we should know better, or make us kind of nervous and uncomfortable if they stare too much. But making non-creepy eye contact, and there's a fine line between creepy and non-creepy, can be good because again, psychologically, people kind of trust them, even though again, irrelevant. Sweating. There's the commercial, never let them see you sweat. And we assume that people who are sweaty are doing what? When you're talking to someone, they seem like sweaty, they're probably stressed, they're probably nervous, they're probably lying. Unless, of course, is just warm. And there are people who sweat because they are nervous, but they're not nervous about lying, they're just nervous about speaking. And similarly, things like nervous laughter. Again, it doesn't mean psychologically, people often think, aha, I can tell when someone's lying if their hand is like damp from sweat or they do that nervous laugh, or their handshake is strong, they must be telling the truth. But of course, none of that matters. If a person is a good liar, they're going to learn to make eye contact, have a firm handshake, and not laugh. These are all things a person can learn to do, to be a convincing liar. But again, psychologically, a lot of people think, I've heard people, more so in the past, where people would say, well, person looked me right in the eye, gave me a firm, dry handshake, I know they're telling the truth. Even then I was thinking, no, it doesn't mean they're telling the truth at all. It just means they have dry hands and they're probably a good liar. Now, physical qualities, of course, are hugely influential. And this varies, the exact content varies from culture to culture. But in the United States, we have a pretty clear, set of qualities that provide psychological credibility. In general, are males or people who identify as male seen as more credible than females, or people who identify as females? Who gets believed in that? Yeah, this is to be terrifying. So, you may think like today there'd be like women can have equal credibility, but if you look at like court cases, it's still a huge problem. Things like assault, sexual assault, especially harassment, where it was seen as quite an accomplishment even recently that when Judge Kavanaugh was going through his confirmation, they actually took a woman seriously. Because if you go back to Clarence Thomas's time, when Anita Hill was testifying, some people believed her, but many people in Congress just did not because she lacked, real credibility. She seemed very, very credible. It was just psychological. Women simply were not regarded as to be taken seriously. So it's improved over the years, even in my lifetime, but still a factor in things like obviously in courts, also in professions. Women are taken, still less seriously, and I've seen this happen even recently, like I've been confused with being in charge of something when I'm not in charge of something. The person who's a woman is in charge of this thing, not me. I'm faculty, they're the administrator. And so people can make that mistake. Height. Does being tall make you more truthful, more likely to be right? No, it just means you can reach the cookies easier, which is a good skill. But psychologically, people do tend to assign to taller people many positive qualities, like leadership abilities, truthfulness, integrity, things that have nothing to do with height. Now, people who do like evolutionary theory say this is probably like a leftover from when we were, pre-civilization humans, where being tall would be an advantage. And this is why typically you see people who are running for president tend to be taller, and tallness is seen as being bigger as credible. So if you want to be credible, I guess be tall. But of course, no connection. Age is also a factor. Now, as I say, this one's kind of complicated because in some cases, does being older make someone seem more credible? Yeah, so for example, when you're seeing, used to be when you'd see like commercials for investments, like trading stock, et cetera, or banking, you'd see someone who was not too old, because you don't want to be like too old, but they'd have like a little gray in their temples, to show that they're a person who's more experienced. And so in that case, being older was seen as having more credibility. But of course, in certain circumstances, the reverse holds true. For example, suppose you're a company like Microsoft, who just bought Activision Blizzard, and you're going to have someone, be the public face for the new Activision Blizzard. Would you want someone like old, or would you want a young person? Yeah, young. Why? Because gamers are, they're young and cool. Although most gamers are actually old. The average age for gamers is actually pretty old. There's some real old people playing, because video games have been around a long time, since like the 70s. So there are people who could be like in their 80s or 90s still playing video games. And we generally think of it as like, for younger people. And that's the face you get like on like on Twitch. You generally see people who are younger, because if they had someone who was older, they'd probably seem a little ridiculous, even though they could be a very good gamer. So age, again, nothing to do with credibility. A person could be young and could be brilliant at stocks and banking and finances. A person could be old and could be brilliant at, doing dungeon runs and raids in World of Warcraft, or, toning the noobs in Call of Duty. Is that something? Toning the noobs? Still used? I turned all the chat off in all my games just because the first time I heard it, I'm like, yeah, that's all off. The chat is off. And back in the day, we used to have to clip off like a plug and put it in the Xbox control, because they didn't have a chat off, because they didn't realize what people were like when online gaming first had chat. And you learn pretty quickly, like nothing anybody had to say was going to be anything good. I have not listened to anybody who's not my friend since the 2000, I think. And I don't regret any of it, because it's all terrible. Ethnicity. Now in the US, if you want to be credible, what should you be? Yeah, you should be. For ethnicity, well, psychologically, what's considered the most believable, credible ethnicity, the default that people believe?
More like race.
Yeah.
Like old and white.
Yeah, super credible. But are white people more likely to tell the truth? No. No. No connection between ethnicity and truth. Obviously, this is kind of an obvious thing, but in the United States, ethnicity and credibility have always been strongly linked, even though logically there's no connection. And probably, like, to be honest, like people who are older white people in power, not to be racist, but we're probably more likely to maybe. I guess because they have more to lie about. That's probably That's probably an example of, bias right there. So ethnicity, again, nothing to do with actual credibility, logically, but psychologically very effective, and clearly a problem. Language. If you're going to do like a documentary and you wanted people to like really like it and believe it, what accent should you have? British. Everything sounds like, to at least to many Americans, British stuff sounds like credible. I guess because we've had so many documentaries done by the British. Other accents seem less credible. There's a comedian who does, I can't remember the name, but they do like the same kind of thing, but with different accents. Like, I think it's something like Einstein said or something. And of course, the content is like obviously brilliant, but depending on the accent the person's using, it sounds either smart or not, just based on the accent. Because we have biases, we have preconceived notions about how people with certain accents, whether they're credible, believable, or not. And of course, there's no connection. And that that comic bit is pretty good about this because same exact words, but I noticed most of them like, yeah, this guy's totally right. When you hear it in British, it sounds totally plausible. But if someone's using like what we would call in a biased way, kind of like backwards accent, even though it's the same thing, it doesn't sound as credible, even though it's the exact same words. Mannerisms. If you look at speakers, the way you gesture and stuff can weirdly affect credibility. And so if someone has like a nervous twitch or something, that can seemingly lower their credibility. They also say doing certain gestures increases your credibility. If you look at people like Hitler, it's a terrible example. He has all these, the way you gesture, like broad gestures, etc. And you always want to check the current science, but they do claim that how you gesture and hold yourself does affect people psychologically. But always check the latest science, could be overturned. Last, loudness and confidence. In general, people who are louder are sometimes seen as more credible. Although sometimes that can kind of backfire. Someone can just seem kind of like loud and not. And of course, confidence is very important. People tend to think that someone is confident that they must be telling the truth. But it just means they're confident. You've probably seen this too, where people are, they're totally wrong, but they're 100% confident they're right. And in some cases, it's right before they like when someone is totally confident that the electricity has been turned off and they're going to work on it. Sometimes, well, so it's not that confidence is bad, and you want to convey confidence psychologically, but of course it proves nothing. So on the side of good, these have no effect on credibility, either for or against. They mean nothing. Psychologically, though, these are all very powerful. So as a practical matter, if there are factors you can control, you would want to exploit them, either on the side of good, so what you're saying truthfully seems more credible, or on the side of evil, you can make things that are untrue seem totally true. You just got to pick the right sort of liar to check off these boxes. So that concludes our stuff for today. We didn't finish chapter 4, obviously, but again, the exam 1 doesn't deadline until farther in the future, and I'll double check on the quizzes and assignments for the last part to make sure that they're still accessible. I'm like 99% certain they are, but I want to be 100% certain. So have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you in the future.